speakers tonight are Professor David Issacs, who was born in London and moved to Sydney with his family in 1989. He is a consultant paediatrician at the Children's Hospital at Westmead and Professor of Paediatric Infectious Diseases at the University of Sydney. David started the Health Assessment for Refugee Kids, HARC, Refugee Clinic in 2005, which now sees over 400 asylum seeker and refugee children a year. In late 2014, he went to consult on children and has become a more vocal advocate for children in detention ever since.
The aim of tonight was to talk about hiding child abuse in detention centres, moral, health and legal aspects of this. And I think we've heard already very eloquently from Ebony about the health issues. She's described quite well what happens. In fact, she's probably given much more data than I'm going to give tonight. And also the legal ramifications. And I also want to think about the moral, ethical aspects of this as well. So just from I should also say that my son Mark and his friend Tim are in the audience over there, eating where it's not allowed to be eating in here, but I've just done that, so we'll all break the laws together here. And Mark was the first one from our family to go to Nauru, and Tim also worked on Nauru for the Salvation Army. Okay, and the way that the government does this is to get other people to do it. So the whole Guantanamo Bay argument is because if someone arrives in Australia, you're not legally allowed then to move them out of the country. But if you say that Christmas Island is no longer part of Australia, so you're meant to have a passport to go to Christmas Island, but it's actually still part of Western Australia, so it's a bit bizarre. Okay, but Christmas Island's been excised, and then you use Nauru and Manus, that Nauru's an independent nation with a population of about 10,000 people, that's all. It's smaller than Glebe. I mean it. And then Manus Island, which is part of Papua New Guinea. That way you don't have to be subjected to Australian laws. So that is the Guantanamo Bay part of it, if you like, is that there's been a deliberate avoidance of Australian laws and of Australian observation of what's going on. The other aspect, of course, is secrecy that Ebony's already highlighted. So if you're offshore, then you're not easy to see what's going on. And so witness accounts, like Mark's, as Mark's written a book about this, and like people like myself going to the newspapers and describing what going on television, describing what we've seen, those are the only eyewitness accounts you're going to get, and the government's tried to stop that happening with the Border Force Act. So I'll get and talk to the Border Force Act and the morality of that perhaps in a little bit, but predominantly we were talking about child abuse. Of course, that's an area with which I'm very familiar as a consultant paediatrician. So, if I, or a teacher, witnesses what we think is child abuse in Australia, and we suspect it, we have a statutory obligation to report it. It's a legal obligation, let alone a moral one. And when I've got a colleague who doesn't believe that it's child abuse, and a case in the hospital which happens, I sometimes report it anyway, and they say, oh, but I didn't think it was. It's my patient. And I say, well, I've got a statutory obligation to report it. And so I use that as a way of making sure that it gets to attention. So, mandatory for us to notify child abuse when it happens in Australia. The sinister thing is that with the Border Force Act, if child abuse happens on Nauru, people could actually go to prison for reporting it. Now the government will deny that, and they'll say, oh no, there's whistleblowing legislation that you can use, and you can do it to protect people. But in practice, the Border Force Act is very opaque. So the Border Force Act came in on July the 1st. But it's not clear from the Border Force Act whether if someone speaks out after July the 1st about something that happened before the July the 1st, and they were contracted to the government, directly or indirectly, whether the Border Force Act applies to that person. So, for example, I've spoken since July the 1st about things that happened before the July the 1st, which I had not talked about previously, in an effort to try and provoke the government to take me to court. And I did this partly because Julian Burnside, Mark, my son, I was a bit scared about doing all of this, and Mark said, I'll get Julian Burnside onto this. And Julian Burnside said, don't worry, David, they'll never prosecute you because you're a professor. I said, well, what about my nurse who came with me? Well, they might prosecute her, but don't worry, if they prosecute either of you, I'd really like them to, and we'll give you the best defence that money can buy, but gratis for you. I said, oh, that's really reassuring, thanks. What happens if you lose? No, I'm not going to lose. I said, yeah, but who goes to prison? Is it you or me? No, David. It's not going to happen. But I think that the Border Force Act there is not there to silence me. It's there to silence my son, Mark. It's there to silence the nurse who works with me, Alana. It's there to silence the Nicole judges and the Tims who've worked there, thought it was horrific, and want to talk about it. Because the reason Mark wrote his book, the reason that I started advocating so vigorously after going to Nauru is it's horrific. When you see what happens and what is being done in our name to human beings, you are horrified. You think you've heard it, and yes, you can sort of picture what it is, but it's not true. It's not the same until you go there and see it. Child after child after child, family after family after family, just in total despair. Been there on average 14 months when I went there, so I was there last December on Nauru. The average length of stay for families was 14 months. That had increased from 10 weeks under the previous regime. So that this government's insistence that they've got many more people out of detention, and what is Gillian Triggs doing with her inquiry, belies the fact that you've increased the trauma, as Ebony said, by prolonging the period of detention. So people can cope with a few weeks, but once you get to months and months and years and don't know what's going to happen. I mean, one of the things that Mark said to me, and he writes in his book, is it's all very well that you're there for such a long time, but if you don't know what's happening to you, think about it. If you are a convicted Australian criminal and you go to prison, you know what day you're going to come out. But if you're an asylum seeker who's done no crime and you're on Nauru, you don't know when you're going to come out. They won't tell you when your application is going to be processed. So you're in this sort of Kafkaesque situation of being completely helpless, powerless, frustrated. You've got no control over your life, or even a prisoner in jail has some control because they know that day I come out so I can plan ahead and so on, but an asylum seeker can't do that. It's that despair that we're talking about that is just so overwhelming when you see it. So I was only there for 5 days. When I came back I was having nightmares. I asked Alana, the nurse, yes, she was having nightmares as well. You're having nightmares for these families that you've seen, for awful things that you've seen. 6-year-old girl tried to hang herself. I've never seen that in my whole career before. And quite a serious suicide attempt by this girl. Luckily there was a child psychiatrist on the island for 4 days at the time as well, and we got her a little bit of help there. But it's band-aid stuff. You can't repair the post-traumatic stress disorder if you continue with the stress. Our psychologists won't see children with post-traumatic stress disorder when the stress is continuing, the cause of the PTSD is continuing. Okay. The other thing is that the government's response to child abuse is not one that we're very hopeful about. So one of the things that happened was that the Save the Children workers who had the contract after Salvation Army to look after children on the island started to say, we're seeing cases, the mums are telling us these children are being abused by people on the island. And 10 Save the Children workers were dismissed summarily. There's virtually no right of appeal. They can go to a lawyer, perhaps, to try and get recompense later, but these are 23, 24-year-olds. They don't want to be involved in a legal case like that. They'll just get on with their life and do something else. And they were dismissed, and the reason they were dismissed was for coaching the mothers to say their children had been abused. When the report subsequently came out, it turned out the children were being abused. Surprise, surprise. And these young ladies were not, they were all women, were not coaching the mothers. The mothers were telling the truth, and the women were trying to expose it. So if the Border Force Act says, oh, don't worry, whistleblowers will be protected, I don't think we need to hold our breath before we see a whistleblower who won't be protected by the Border Force Act, or by previous legislation, and the Border Force Act will be enacted. And even if the Border Force Act is never enacted, it's there as a deterrent, just as Nauru and Manus are there as deterrents. Okay? But what sort of country introduces legislation to silence whistleblowers? What sort of country do both major parties introduce it? Because the Labour Party went along with it just as much as the Liberal Party introduced it. The only people who've spoken up against it are the Greens, against the Border Force Act. It's quite extraordinary legislation if you think about it. It's the sort of thing you would expect in a fascist country, isn't it?
Yes.
That's what we're turning.
And it is, that's what we're turning into, and I think we need to be very much aware of that this is a really dangerous precedent. If we don't protest about this, then, then we're accepting it. So we need to talk about it. And there are sinister parallels here, I think, with the current situation of institutional child abuse. It's been going on for years and was covered up and so on. And now it's all coming out. And that's going to come out. There'll be more instances of child abuse coming out later than are already out there. Okay, you can bet that we're only seeing a bit of it now, because it takes a long time for all of these things to come out. And so it's not just going to be the forgotten children. This is going to have a legacy for years of mental health problems for the children, for their parents. And we're culpable. And there may even be legal implications when good people like Ebony say, come on, let's sue the government for this. So not only are we spending an absolute fortune to keep people on Nauru, I mean, the cost to keep one child on Nauru for a year is over $500,000. Over $500,000 per person per year. Okay? So it doesn't even make any economic sense, let alone what's going to happen to these families. So we're paying to cause this sort of terrible things happening to people. One of the things that Ebony hinted at was that prolonged immigration detention in detention centres is itself child abuse, a form of child abuse. It's certainly harming the children. It's very likely giving them long-term sequelae, mental health problems. And we actually, at the hospital I work at, the Children's Hospital of Westmead, we've run a refugee clinic, as Mary said, and we got a keen medical student come along who'd done law beforehand, I may say, Ebony. So he said, right, we'll get you out on a questionnaire asking all the doctors what they do, what they think about asylum seekers and refugees. And of course, not being political at all, we thought it would be quite good to be able to publish it in a journal that tends to go to the press about these things, which is the Medical Journal of Australia. So we did publish it, and it said that 85% of paediatricians in this country, of the ones surveyed, thought that keeping children in mandatory detention is institutional child abuse. It is indeed child abuse. So the paediatricians think so. Most of the doctors think so in this country as well. That we heard about the protest at Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne. So, and the reason we think it's child abuse is because the longer you are in detention, the greater the risk of long-standing mental health problems. One of the groups of children that we see are unaccompanied minors. So they come without their parents. And they're very likely to suffer long-term mental health problems. Okay, so if it's child abuse, we should notify their guardian, okay? Unfortunately, their guardian is the Minister for Immigration and Border Control. Actually, is also their jailer. Well, there's an irony, isn't there? So one of the things that Ebony also alluded to, and I'm going to go to now, is the question of torture. And how do you... So I've just been writing a paper, trying to write a paper for a medical ethical journal, and it's one that'll get a lot of publicity if it is published, and it's a paper, a journal in the United Kingdom, published in the United Kingdom out of Oxford. And so it's... I'm trying to say that what is being done to asylum seekers in immigration detention is torture, counts as torture. And so you have to then define torture, and the United Nations has quite a complicated definition of torture. One or two people have said it's tantamount to torture. Peter Young said that. And the UN rapporteur on torture said that quite a lot of what we do to people fulfills the definition of torture, but neither of them are quite specific about what they meant torture is. So torture has to be inflicted on people by an agency, a government agency, or delegated to other people. So the way that our government does it is we delegate to Transfield, who are a security firm, and we delegate to someone who acts as carers, which used to be Salvation Army, now Save the Children, and then you delegate to health providers, and there's a private health organisation called International Health and Medical Services, IHMS, and they're a part of International SOS. Okay, so you should know that IHMS are actually a sub-part group of an organisation called International SOS. Okay, and they get a fairly lucrative contract to look after asylum seekers, $1.4 billion this year, okay? And so it's not a small conflict of interest, that. And if, as I did, you go and work on Nauru for 5 days for IHMS, you get paid incredibly well. So I said, right, that's all going to be donated to our refugee clinic because you don't want to make money out of this. And so did the nurse who went with me. But you go there and you sign a contract that says, I will not criticise anything that IHMS does, and I won't criticise anything the Department of Immigration and Border Protection does. Isn't that interesting? You're signing a contract with IHMS, but you're not allowed to criticise what the government does. Okay, but they've got such a conflict of interest there, and so want to keep that lucrative contract, that they try and silence any opposition. And when you go there, I was just so horrified that the only thing I could promise to all these families is that I would give them a voice, that I would advocate for them, regardless of having signed this contract. And interestingly, Julian Burnside, again I was a bit worried, and Mark helped me out and got Julian Burnside involved again, and he said, you are allowed to report iniquity, so evil, and that is not breaking your contract. So then I felt a bit safer about that one. Okay, so is this torture? And in this article I spent a bit of time trying to detail exactly what is done. So why, if I'm saying that prolonged detention in immigration is torture, then doesn't that mean that every prisoner that we convict and put in prison is also being tortured by us?
Yep.
Is that the same thing?
No.
Well, and so my argument is to try and say that's not the same thing. I mean, interestingly, there's a fascinating guy who's now a surgeon at Macquarie Hospital, Munjad al-Madiris, and he's an Iraqi asylum seeker who came and was in Curtin. He's written a book called Walking Free, fascinating book, and I'll plug your book later, Mark. Okay, and Walking Free, he describes how he was in Curtin Detention Centre and how awful it was, and then there was a breakout of detention from the Curtin Detention Centre, and he was accused of being the ringleader, and sent to prison. He said prison was just a doddle compared with Curtin detention centre. You got proper meals, you could shower in peace and so on. And he said Curtin was much, much worse than prison. But the other thing that is different, of course, is that the prisoner knows when they're going to get out. And also the prisoner's actually done something. They've broken the law. And so there's some sort of sense of justice in that. Whereas if you've not broken the law and yet you go to prison for it, think of your feeling of injustice that's going to be with you forever in your heart for that. You're just going to be bitter about it. To be punished for something you've done nothing wrong, it's not illegal to seek asylum. And so that's why I think it is torture. And that's the argument that I've made in this article. What's more, we're an international laughingstock. The world looks at us aghast at what we're doing. I wrote an article for British Medical Journal and then was interviewed on BBC World Radio, and everyone wanted to ring up and ask, what are we doing? And so I did interviews with Russian television. They said, don't you use guns? We would, they said. They were trying to get hints about how best to deal with their asylum seekers. But all the other countries in Europe that wanted interviews with me wanted them because they wanted to counteract the very vicious right-wing groups who said we should be like Australia. So in Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland and other countries, they were all had vicious right-wing groups, racist groups, who would say we should be as ghastly as Australia because that's the way of deterring people. And yet Europe, with so many more asylum seekers, has kept their heart. And we need to keep ours. And so I'm going to end on a slightly optimistic note as well, which is I just think we have got a heart. I'm not saying that Australians don't have a heart. And that terrible picture of little Aylan Kurdi, the little boy who drowned, seemed to awaken that heart. I think it's very interesting that a visual image is what it takes sometimes. You can hear about 100 children in detention and how awful it is, and I can tell you all of that, but when you see it with your own eyes, that's when you suddenly wake up to the fact that this isn't okay. So thank you. I hope in future that we'll be able to persuade others that that's okay. I wonder if the way is to change public opinion. That's the way we've got to do it, because the political parties will swing the way that public opinion goes. And I'm not unhopeful that we can't change public opinion. I think Aylan Kurdi is the beginning of that, possibly. We need to keep talking about this. We need to be saying that this is not the way a good country behaves, is to lock people up in prison for no crime. And that we need, perhaps, to get a royal commission out there to look at what's happening in our detention centres and close them once and for all. Thank you.